If you have your scripture, I invite you to open to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11. This is a somewhat long chapter, but that's okay. I'm going to read the whole thing, and we'll get through that, and we'll see what God has for us. So let's listen now in faith to God's word. And we're going to pick it up in verse 2. That's really where this section begins. Remember, last week we heard the heavenly messenger speaking to Daniel said, "And now I will show you the truth." And that's where we begin with the revelation of the truth, starting there in verse 2. "Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. And then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to the others besides these. And then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. And from a branch from her roots one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the kings of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. And then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first. And after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. And then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward, he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but the commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon them. And then he shall turn his face back and toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. And then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully. And he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the 2 kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, He shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help. And many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. This is God's word. I want to suggest that the last half of the last verse is the essence of our message today. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. That's the conclusion of it all. This chapter might be treated in Bible classes. We do not see how it could be used for a sermon or for sermons. This one commentator's quip showed up in actually two other commentaries this week, just to kind of drive the point home of how daunting it is to preach this chapter. That should set you a little bit on edge to listen attentively if it happens today. Another thought, actually, the risk of getting bogged down in this closing section of Daniel was simply too great, and his solution was to preach all three of the last chapters all at one setting and just have at it and be done, to somehow blind the congregation with the speed with which you burn through it all and your head spinning. One of my kids gave me the best advice, short and sweet. She said, he shall come to his end. Jesus is the eternal king, the end. I'm going to actually follow that last outline pretty much. I'm going to unpack it a bit more than that. So what's the challenge here? The challenge here is that this chapter is full of details. Did you figure out how many kings of the north and kings of the south there were going back and forth, even as the ice falls down? Yeah, don't worry about that. How many kings were it? Lots. There's just so much dizzying busyness here in this chapter. And the vast majority of it is a prophecy concerning a time that is more than 150 years before Christ. It's all kind of finished and done before Jesus even shows up in the scene, at least until we get down to verse 36, I believe. And yet, it is also fulfilled in exquisite detail and exactness. You see, when the Jews in Israel during the time of the middle 2nd century BC were reading this, they would know exactly who each of these kings of the north, king of the south, the goings in betweens, the different queens and princesses, all that kind of stuff. They would have known exactly who that was. But the question still remains, how does any of it pertain to 21st century people, to Christians today? And I believe the best answer to this is to consider the context. So not quite preaching 3 chapters at once, but we need to remember, as we saw last week, that Daniel 10 is a doozy of an introduction. There's a lot going on there. I mean, Daniel is wrung out by the presence and the appearance of the heavenly messenger. And here at the ending of Daniel 11, it points us to the final end of the Almighty's and our enemies. What's that ending? He shall come to his end. And that's it. Daniel 10, going back to the end of last chapter, Daniel 10, verse 19 reminds us. This is the messenger. He said, "O man greatly loved." This is the second time that Daniel's already been told that he's greatly loved. "O man greatly loved, fear not, peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage." And as he spoke to me, I was strengthened. And I said, "Let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me." That's where we are. Daniel, the one who's loved, who's told not to fear, the one who's given this great blessing of peace be with you, and then the promise of the presence of God that he would be with him. And so the heavenly messenger prepares Daniel for this message, and there it is in verse 2 of chapter 11. I'm going to show you the truth, and here it comes. The first part of this chapter, verse 2 down to verse 20, I'll say, which basically covers the window of time from shortly after Daniel's life all the way down to the beginning of Antiochus Epiphanes Antiochus IV's reign in 170 BC, in that window of time. I think we're reminded of these words, Shakespeare's Macbeth. Do any of you kids memorize soliloquies these days? Is that a thing that kids do? We had to do that. So I'm not going to do it from memory, but here's Macbeth's most famous soliloquy. You can imagine, 15-year-old Tim practicing with my Georgia accent. I didn't have a Georgia accent, but anyway. "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." That sums up these 20 verses pretty well. We see here in these verses the worst of palace intrigues, of coups, of conquest. There's a precision there. Did you catch the one king who wasn't going to die by violence or war? That king refers to one who actually was put aside by poison. So, yeah, it's all there. Their petty pace only scrambles for power and glory and riches. Their nameless deeds in Daniel are named in our history books. Xerxes. That's Esther's Ahasuerus. Xerxes, his million-man army of immortals, dominated that portion of the world with unbelievable power. It said when the immortals marched, they won everything, at least until Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great comes along. And then we have a long litany of Antiochuses and Ptolemies and Seleucuses, all with numbers. Ptolemy 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, something like that. I mentioned it. Yeah, let me tell you. This section covers Ptolemy's 1 to 6 from the year 323, that's when Alexander died, all the way down to the year 145, after interacting with Antiochus Epiphanes. On the north, Seleucus, Antiochus, Seleucus. We get down to Seleucus IV, Antiochus the Fourth. It's all there. And they also had other names. A lot of these were the Greats, or Epiphanes, or Euergetes, or Philopater. They loved giving themselves the names. Magnus, Antiochus the Third, the Great, the Magnus. But you know what's interesting? This section of Daniel's vision, these 20 verses, it gives one verse to Persia, one of the world empires of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. Remember, after the head of gold, it was the chest of silver, torso of silver. That's Persia. It's glorious and it's powerful. Greece gets 2 verses, well, 1.5 actually, and Persia attacks Greece, and what happens? Greece wins. 2 on Greece, and then an extended segment on the kings of the north and the kings of the south. That's one of the 4 kingdoms that fell out of Alexander the Great's empire. It's pretty wild. That first bit, before you get to the kings of the north, kings of the south, that's covering a couple hundred years. And then this last portion, actually, all of this section goes from 323 BC to 175 BC. And even then, it still weights heavily down toward Antiochus III, who was Epiphanes' father. But they're not named. It's just this frenetic back and forth. One commentator gave this brief summary of this section. It hardly seems right for Alexander the Great to get whisked off the page in just 27 Hebrew words, and all the attention be focused on these 2 dynasties of also-rans, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. But Alexander doesn't matter much. Not here. The reason for the zoom lens on the kings of the south and the north is because the people of God, a substantial number of them at least, will be back in the land of Israel, living on that little sliver of land at the east end of the Mediterranean, that crossroads where Africa, Asia, and Europe come together, where they will be scrunched between and subject to the whims of these 2 opposing dynasties. Besides the fortunes of God's people, Alexander's empire doesn't much matter. That's a striking way to put it. You can read books. Whole books written about the histories of Xerxes. The whole history is written about Alexander the Great's massive global conquest. And it's an amazing story that you'll read there. It is really, really hard to find books written about the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties. They just, from a historical standpoint, they just don't seem to matter. Kids don't learn the sequence of the reigning monarchs of the Ptolemy dynasty because most of us are like, so what? It really doesn't seem to amount to a hill of beans. And yet you get verse after verse after verse of all this back and forth palace intrigue. And if you didn't figure it out, these 2 vestiges of Alexander the Great's empire, they didn't like each other. No, that's not entirely true. They liked to swap children. So they'd marry off brides back and forth to try and get the upper hand. And a couple places in there, you get the decided sense that there's one occasion when one of the Seleucid kings married off his daughter with a view of getting one of his grandsons to be on the throne of Egypt, and that he would have the upper hand. She got there and she realized she liked the Egyptian guy, so she switched sides, and all the father's plans are frustrated. And suddenly it's like, wait, you're supposed to be on my side. I said, no, I'm on my husband's side. All this back and forth. So all the way from Xerxes to Seleucus IV, lies, schemes, conspiracies, the ups and downs of confusion of war and political turmoil. It's what's in here. But the text doesn't want us to simply hear the noise and the racket of war back and forth, back and forth. I think God wants us to see another expression of one of the main words out of Ecclesiastes, futility. What is actually gained? When you read the history books of Xerxes and Alexander the Great, you hear about the victories along the way where there's global dominion, expansion of the kingdom, all those kinds of things, and the growth and eventual fall of it. But there's something that happens. This section, it's literally back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with a net gain of nothing. This, I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but it's worth it. Eh, What are there any towns here that have particular rivalries? I kind of want to go across Vermont, New Hampshire. And so it'd be like, if Hanover, I'll go with Hanover. Hanover has a particular beef with Norwich. I know they almost seem the same, but they're not quite. But it's like this back and forth, and in the end, they all go to high school together, and no one's the worse off. It's just kind of the same. That's what it was here. That's what we're reading about. But I want you to hear this futility because the scripture pulls it out. See if you can start hearing how God signals the futility of this. We'll start in verse 4. But his kingdom shall be broken and divided. Verse 6. But she will not hold on to the strength of her arm, but she will be given over. Verse 9. But he shall return to his land. Verse 11. But the multitude shall be given into his hand. Verse 12. But he will not remain strong. Verse 14, violent ones among your own people will assert themselves to fulfill a vision, but they will fail. Verse 17, and the daughter of women he will give to him to destroy, but it will not stand and will not prove to his advantage. Verse 18, but a commander shall put an end to his arrogance. Verse 19, but he shall stumble and fall and will not be found. Verse 20, but within a few days he will be broken, but not in anger or battle. Do you hear this? We have this hammering home that for all of the intentions of Ptolemies and Antiochuses and Seleucises, for all of their intention, but it didn't work out. Why do you think it doesn't work out? It's almost like Paul's contrast in Ephesians 2. We're children of wrath, but God is the great bringer of contrast. And they intend this here back in the 4th, 3rd, 2nd century BC. They're intending it to somehow advance their prestige, their money, their glory. But God frustrates it. But when it comes to redemption, but God who's rich in mercy saves sinners. So this hammers us. It just is repeated. It's futile. It will not succeed. It doesn't advance anything. Ian Duguid writes of or speaks of a profound perspective on history here. He says this: on one level, it's the continual story of wars and rumors of wars. As one human ruler and empire after another seeks to gain power by cunning or force, yet though the tide in the affairs of men comes in and goes out, in the end it accomplishes precisely nothing. The balance of power in earthly politics may shift, but it never comes to a permanent rest. Daniel 11 shows us the fallen world pursuing the wind and finding it elusive. What do power and politics gain for all of their toil? What do power and politics gain for all of their effort? Nothing. Or as the Lord answers Habakkuk in Habakkuk 2, verse 13, why is it not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire and nations weary themselves for nothing? God is the one who frustrates the plans of men, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, as Macbeth would talk about. But people of God, we need to hear this. We need to understand that this view of history that says the things that we think are the major players in history, not that big a deal sometimes. And the things that are small, we may not notice it, but they affect us in a particular way. All of it is that this is subject to the Lord of history. Who is the Lord of history? The Almighty. How often do God's people around the world feel that we're simply, we're grist in the mill being ground down to flour? How many of you kids have gone to ever see a mill that grinds with their stones, with the millstones? Anybody ever go up there? If you go up to Littleton, you can see one up there that's in operation. What happens when grain is being ground down? It starts with your good sized kernel, and it ends up, depending how far you go, it can go down to like cornmeal mush, or it can go down to superfine flour if you want to take it all the way down. Doesn't that feel like how we are as God's people sometimes, that we're caught in the gears, we're caught in the stone, we're caught in it's just Israel in this time, that north-south highway between the kings of the north, kings of the south, it's going right through the promised land. It's going right through the beautiful land, as God says here in this chapter. We simply sometimes feel that we're caught between all the angry heavyweights in the world smashing at each other, but we pay the price. Verse 21 to 35 turns to the specific, in a sense, the crowning achievement of all the kings of the north, kings of the south, and it's Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. Once again, he wants glory by beating up on the south. He's from the northern area around Syria. He's the son of Antiochus III. He's actually the brother of Seleucus IV, who came on the throne first. So he replaces his brother. And as any good royal family would do, he probably saw to it that his nephew, his brother's sons, one of them was left in a Roman prison. The other one mysteriously died as an infant. That's who these folks were. So he's in power. That's what he wants. And so in verses 21 and 35, we move from the futility of all that was going on before to this aspect of the insanity of what we saw before. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that Antiochus IV, by his contemporaries, was known as both a smooth-talking, gracious person with an edge of he always got what he wanted. I mean, he was dangerous. He was not a nice man. He talked a pretty good game when there's money on the line, but when he didn't get what he wanted, when he didn't get what he wanted from Jerusalem, from the treasury in the temple, he went berserk, violent. And so we see that this violent, brutal man, one of the times he's licking his wounds after not quite getting Egypt the way he wanted because the Romans showed up. Those Romans ruined everything. So powerful. So he goes home, and maybe you've seen someone, or maybe you've been frustrated yourself. Something just, you got denied it and kick the door or the wall or the rock or whatever it is. Hopefully don't kick a dog, but that's what he's doing. He's frustrated. And so what does he do? He wants to kick the dog of Jerusalem, of Israel. And it's savage. This puts us in the window of 168 BC. But what's intense about this? If we look back at what the angel had already said about this fulfillment, we notice that verses 2 to 20 cover from 530 to 175, that window of time, about 355 years in 19 verses. But here in 21 to 35, it covers events that go from 175 to 163, 12 years, getting 15 verses, 12 years. I mean, this is a life within a lifetime. This is, half a generation. There's this focus down on this one particular thing. This reign of Antiochus Epiphanes gets equal space with 350 years before him, including Xerxes and Alexander the Great. And I got to tell you, Antiochus is a nobody, except for what he does to God's people. Why does he get such space? Why is this angel so bent on making sure this is the truth that Daniel gets? Part of it is this. Beginning in 167 BC, Antiochus launches a brutal campaign against God's covenant people. He was set on absolutely gutting the vitals of biblical faith. He was determined to see every Jew apostatize. His goal was to get everyone who said, I believe in God, to say, God who? He stripped them of their sacraments, so there was a death penalty for circumcising your infants. He tried to strip them of their sacrifice. They needed to offer pagan offerings to Zeus right there in the temple. That was the abomination that makes desolate. He tried to prevent their observing the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, if you tried to go to the temple or a synagogue in the Sabbath, you face a death sentence. He tried to take away the scripture. If you were caught with a the scroll of the law, you were forfeit. Your life was gone. And so in Antiochus's reign, his reign of terror, if you would, he wanted Israel to face this one choice. You either live pagan or you're a dead Israelite. That's it. Those are your options. Give in, you'll be fine. Resist, dead. Sadly, during this time, there were many in Israel, many Jews who gave in, but not everyone. The severity of the trouble, in a sense, explains why so much ink is given to this tyrant. This was a deadly time to be faithful to God. But this passage is more than just a warning. I want you to hear, just like in the passage above, the section above with all the kings of the north and south, you had the futility of, but it turned into nothing, but they were overthrown. Here you have, not as frequent, but there's something else here. You hear this governing aspect of a refrain of that time or appointed time. In verse 24, Antiochus is going to plot and scheme, but it's just for a time. It's limited. There's been a limit that's been placed upon him. Verse 27, you see again back and forth intrigue going on, but there is yet an end at the appointed time. I think it refers to when God's timetable is up to have Antiochus removed from the scene of history. Verse 29 also tells that Antiochus is going to make yet another effort against Egypt at the appointed time. That is when God sets it. And it's as if Antiochus, despite all of his intentions to reject God and operate and destroy God's people, he himself is still subject to God's timetable. He can't thwart God's timetable. He can't come in the way. And along the way, what would have happened if he had destroyed God's people in the promised land? What would that do to God's plan of redemption? The Son of David coming through the promised line at the right time. Antiochus couldn't win, but he doesn't know that, does he? And so he is going to rail against God's people. He's going to rave against them until the time of the end, and it is yet at the appointed time. I actually think verse 35 here is talking about the end of his battle, his fight against Israel and his his appointed death. He doesn't die in Israel, by the way. He's out stomping around somewhere else, and he dies of a disease. Again, he dies in the middle of nowhere. Saints, do you believe that God is Lord of your time? What does David say in Psalm 23? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death or the valley of deep darkness, I will not fear. I mean, we go through the valley, but God's with us, right? And God here, even in this window of time when it would be absolutely terrifying to be in the promised land with Antiochus on the rampage, even in chaotic time, it's still God's appointed time. It's still God's sovereignly controlled time. Even though Antiochus is acting as if he can do anything he wants, the reality is he is governed and limited. That God's got a chain on this guy. He's not actually running as free and loose as he thinks. Antiochus can only operate within appointed time. One of my favorite verses out of Romans, and I've gone here before, but I want you to be reminded again. Romans 5, verse 8. What do you see here? I'm sorry, verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. While we were weak, while we could do nothing to bring about the redemption that we needed, while we could do nothing to make ourselves right with God, while we're weak, At the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. That's who our God is in charge of history, in charge of time. But there is a tone shift. Starting in verse 36, there are aspects that sound like Antiochus Epiphanes, but they don't line up with the Antiochus of history. And that's where some people say, oh, well, this is Daniel getting it wrong. So it's kind of funny. You have some of the scholars who want to say the history was written after the fact so they could have the details right. But here they want to say, but they got this part wrong because it doesn't quite line up with Antiochus. I would suggest you really can't try and claim both. I think what we have is Daniel revealed this truth from the heavenly messenger, writes the prehistory of beforehand, prophetically, down to verse 35, and then a different change of perspective to a different future of one who resembles Antiochus, but is worse. This is an example of going from bad to worse, or from really, really bad to absolutely horrible. And I think you see it in some of the language here. It's elevated that this king, he actually does as he wills. He exalts himself and magnifies himself above every god. Antiochus didn't do that. Antiochus IV didn't do that. He saw himself to be the son of God and all those kind of things, as all the leaders did during that time. But this is something else. This is someone else. And so I think what we're seeing here is Antiochus IV is a type, anticipation of the Antichrist, is a type of the final great enemy of God's people who will go on a rant and a tear and try and destroy, as a last gasp, God's people. We're intended by God to see in Antiochus a pattern of this wicked king to come. So this final scourge is going to be like Antiochus, but only worse. Only worse. What do we see here? We see it alludes to his religion in verse 36 to 39. That is, he exalts himself. He magnifies himself above every god. He doesn't pay attention to the gods of his father, and he's not going to pay attention to any god because he's going to magnify himself above all. This should remind us of Paul's words in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 to 4. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. This is the man of lawlessness that we're reading about here. How bad's it going to be? Bad. If Antiochus was bad, if we saw his murderous attacks on God's people were real and brought death and defection, let's not kid ourselves about the Antichrist. Saints, I think when we read about the Antichrist here, we have not only the hope of encouragement that we had before, of God is the God of history, God is in charge, that we don't need to worry about that. But I think we have a particular risk. I think we may actually risk, and put in the category of even unbelief, that we don't really believe that we could fall for this deceit. And I look at you guys, and I think about this myself. I'm clever enough. I have insight enough. I think most of you would say I'm aware of the situation. I wouldn't fall for it. I think we need to be careful. We who are in the West, in particular, in 21st century, we think we're too rational, even too cynical to ever be tempted to confess the divine status of a mere human, of a pretender, even one that's empowered by the evil one himself. We can't imagine that somebody would actually swallow the ridiculous claims of this Antichrist. I would argue that history speaks against us in that claim. Many of you know the name Douglas MacArthur, one of the great generals of World War II, the liberator of the Philippines. He was stationed in the East. He went back and was successful there in governing in and actually, I guess he was the post-war general or governor of Japan even. But in 1951, President Truman recalled General MacArthur. He dismissed him because MacArthur was insubordinate. There was reason to withdraw him. And so he calls him back. By the way, generals can't mouth off at the president and say, you're wrong. It's never really worked well that way. MacArthur, as great as he was, you can't get away with mouthing off against the president. So Truman calls him back. But if you thought we live in a political age, 1951 is a political age too. And so what does Congress do, as every good Congress in opposition do? They invite General MacArthur to come speak to a joint session of Congress, of course. And so he gets up, gives his farewell speech. This is the one that loses the old line about old soldiers never die. They just fade away. He ends his speech and just all accounts say it was just this whispered goodbye. Well, as he steps down into the crowd, Congress erupts in pandemonium. A biography from 1964 called American Caesar frames it this way. It said the legislators were sobbing their praise, struggling to touch his sleeve, all but prostrating themselves in his path. Representative Dewey Short of Missouri, I believe, shouted, "We hear God speak today," or "We heard God speak here today. God in the flesh, the voice of God." That's on the floor of Congress. In New York, Herbert Hoover, for those of you who know your presidential history, Hoover was a long prior president, but Hoover says MacArthur was, quote, a reincarnation of St. Paul into a great general of the army who came out of the East. Cheeks were wet, voices hoarse, chests heaving. General MacArthur was just a soldier. This is blasphemy. And you'd say, well, maybe they're just being hyperbolic. Well, yeah, of course they're being hyperbolic, but it's still blasphemy. How eagerly we can slide it into this God manufacturing business. Wow, I'm going to get in trouble. Are there any contemporary examples that we could think of? Maybe I'll just leave it there. Are there ways that we've risked elevating mere humans to the place of being God in the flesh, the voice of God? How much more do we need to watch and pray that we not enter into temptation? You know what? This idea wasn't new at all. But not only do we see it back in 165 BC in Antiochus Epiphanes, but we see it in Acts 12, verse 22, where Herod, who was the third or fourth of that name at that point, what does Herod do? He gets out and exalts himself. And what do the folks in the crowd say right before the worms come and eat Herod? The voice of a God, not a man. It's almost as if Representative Dewey Short just said, oh, I'll quote Acts for us. It's not new, but it's wicked and wrong. Saints, we can be deceived. And how do we keep from being deceived? Well, we listen to God's word and we trust and lean in him. I would suggest that the very last line is this. For all that you see of this great Antichrist, the viciousness and the power of it, and all of that, he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. That is, in that strip of land between Jerusalem, Mount Zion, and the Mediterranean, in the most obvious spot. He's going to be the one controlling that crossroads. He'll be the one controlling the place of God's people. What happens? With brevity of words is simply this. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. For all the power and the posturing and the way that Antiochus would present himself, or the Antichrist would present himself, these are nothing. The time comes when it's appointed, it's over. Not so with King Jesus. Christ, our King, comes conquering. But what does our King do differently? He makes conquered enemies friends. He delivers those who have rebelled against him to make us sons and daughters of the Most High.